Well, good evening and welcome to our Friday night Bible study. This is for Friday. It'll be the last Friday in June, June the 27th, 2025. And I'm going to call my wife here so she has an opportunity to join us. And we'll go ahead and get started. Are you there?
Hello?
Yeah, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Are you ready to join us?
Yes.
Okay. Have you got it put away where you won't be making any more scratchy noises?
Oh, I can make what kind of noises you like.
I just wanted to make sure when I set it down in front of the mic here that you'd be done with all the ear grinding kind of stuff.
Well, the phone is in my pocket.
Okay. Well, in that case, we're good. My wife won't be able to see this, but she did see it earlier today. So I'm going to go to this display. And that is what we have in our front yard. And that was taken around 7 or 8 o'clock this morning. That's the crepe myrtle tree in our front yard. It's been there since before we bought the house. Now, when we bought the house, that was a much smaller tree. It just keeps growing and growing and getting taller and wider and so on and so forth. In fact, about a month ago when I was doing the lawn, I took the chainsaw to it and took out some of the limbs because it'll let limbs drop down so low they get in the way when I'm mowing. In fact, that closest limb, and let's see, I think I know which direction to take here to get that, is, as you can see here, because of the way of the blooms, awfully close to the ground. But while it's blooming like that, I really don't want to cut it off. So I probably will wait until next year and see how low the limb hangs then.
Guess what?
What?
I can't see that.
Oh, well, okay.
I'm watching you on Facebook.
Okay. What you see on Facebook is going to be a little bit delayed, but that's okay as long as you don't have the audio.
You just
on.
lost sound.
Did I? Well,
Hello?
not according to this, I didn't. Anyway, so just thought I'd share that. That's
You lost sound.
that kind of blossom is one of the things that attracted us to this house and led us to buy it. So it's kind of nice to share the pretty when it's available. So
House, we kind of got it at a discounted rate.
yeah, and we're paying for it through the nose, upkeep since then. But
True.
so well. I did notice it was an odd story in the news as I was getting set up this afternoon. This is out of somewhere in Africa. Students were at a school taking a test, and there was an explosion of some sort nearby, and the noise frightened the students, and they panicked and stampeded, and a number of students died in the resulting stampede. So the explosion was not the cause of the deaths, it was the ensuing panic stampede. This is a known phenomenon, and we have the ability now to understand what happens in things like this because we know what evolution has done to the human race and to our brains and the way we live life. So we get frightened, and evolution says the longer you wait to deal with your fright, the less likely you are to survive. Therefore, we're going to shut down the rational brain so that it's not getting in the way of you getting out of the way, so to speak. And that works in a lot of instances, but in this instance, the rational brain has been shut down. So the rational brain would say, if I keep pushing and running in this situation, people are going to die, and I'm not an immediate threat. Let's stop. That rational brain isn't active in order to get that message to the organism, so the panic and the nonsense continues apace, and bad things happen as a result. So, I think rather than belabor things at this point, we go ahead and get started with our Bible study tonight. So let's bow our heads. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for your watch, care, and protection. We thank you that we have made it this far again, and we thank you that you are so amazing and so wonderful and so faithful. And in return, we would like to show you faithfulness, because we know it is our faith, that is our faithfulness, that taps hold of your strength and makes our healing and restoration possible. As we examine the scriptures and see the broken people portrayed in these stories, help us to see you as the solution to our own brokenness and as the path to eternal life and happiness. We ask in Jesus' name, amen. So, we left off last week with a story of King Jeroboam and King Amaziah. And we read about the end of King Jeroboam II's rule. He was the fourth descendant in the line of Jehu. He was the third descendant of Jehu to become king. And when King Jeroboam II passed, his son Zechariah would take over as king. We've read just that part. We also read about the end of Amaziah. Amaziah was apparently unpopular. It may be because he lost wars with Aram and Israel, or Damascus and Samaria. At any rate, they chased him down and assassinated him. But in Judah, unlike in Israel, if you assassinated the king's son took over. And so at the end of chapter 14, where we ended last week, the people made Amaziah's 16-year-old son, Uzziah, king in his place. And that's how we get to the beginning of chapter 15, which says, Uzziah, son of Amaziah, began to rule over Judah in the 27th year of the reign of King Jeroboam II of Israel. Now, we're going to run into some numbers here in a minute that just don't make any sense, and I don't remember when I did it before how I ratified them or figured them out. I'm just going to tell you, the numbers don't math, and tonight I'm not going to try to make them figure out. Now, we notice there is a footnote there for Uzziah, and that's going to tell us that the Hebrew actually uses Azariah, Amaziah, and then Azariah. But Uzziah and Azariah are variant spellings of the same name, and so we're going to use Uzziah, in part because that's what we find in other parts of the Old Testament for this particular king. So verse 2 then tells us that he was 16 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 52 years. Now this will make him the second longest lasting monarch of Judah, of the southern kingdom. He lasted 52 years. You add that to his 16, you've got 68. He would have been 68 when he died. And we're going to see more about his health situation before long. His mother was Jechaliah from Jerusalem. And I have long suggested that when we see mention of a king's mother, that means that there was a queen mother position in place, and that names her. So, Jechaliah from Jerusalem was the mother of Uzziah and became queen mother when her son became king. He did what was pleasing in the Lord's sight, just as his father Amaziah had done. But he did not destroy the pagan shrines, and the people still offered sacrifices and burned incense there. The Lord struck the king with leprosy, or an infectious skin disease, that's what the footnote will tell us, which lasted until the day he died. He lived in isolation in a separate house. The king's son Jotham was put in charge of the royal palace, and he governed the people of the land. Now, this doesn't give us any timing. It seems pretty clear here that we are dealing with a dual reign here. Uzziah was still alive. He was still, to some extent, in charge, but his son Jotham was dealing with the people directly because none of the people could see the king Uzziah because he had this infectious skin disease. I'm sure that Dr. Thiele would have figured out how long this co-regency lasted, but there was obviously a period of time in which both Jotham and Uzziah served as king of Judah. The rest of the events in Uzziah's reign and everything he did recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Judah. When Uzziah died, he was buried with his ancestors in the city of David, and his son Jotham became the next king. Now, this is a very short narrative for this king, and the only reason we really remember him is because when we get to the prophecy of Isaiah in chapter 6, Isaiah talks about a vision he had of the throne room of the Creator. And he describes the creatures that he met there, and he describes the burning coal that was taken to put on his lips to purify his words. And he tells us at the beginning of the chapter that all of this happened in the year King Uzziah died. So that will help us then where we are in history here. This would be roughly 100 years or so before the Babylonian captivity. And tonight we will probably reach the account of the Assyrian captivity of the northern kingdom, because that's going to come up pretty shortly here. So let's read on. We've covered Uzziah now. Now it talks about Zechariah. Zechariah was the fourth descendant of Jehu to take the throne of Israel. Zechariah, son of Jeroboam II, began to rule over Israel in the 38th year of King Uzziah's reign in Judah. Now that's the number that for some odd reason doesn't make any sense. Yes, King Uzziah had 38 years, but it says up here that Uzziah began to rule in the 27th year of the reign of King Jeroboam II. And if you look back, King Jeroboam II only ruled for 41 years. So he would have had only 4 years left at this point when Uzziah began to rule. So I can't make those numbers make sense. I haven't sat down and drawn it out and tried to suss it out or look up Dr. Thiele's book and see what he says about it. The numbers don't really add up, but then it's going to be used continuing on through here. So,
You want me to explain the math to you?
yeah.
Well, let me hear the problem.
I know how you math. Maybe you can make this math. I can't.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
He reigned in Samaria 6 months. Zechariah did what was evil in the Lord's sight, as his ancestors had done. He refused to turn from the sins that Jeroboam, son of Nebat, had led Israel to commit. Now, I'm going to suggest that we're seeing some bias in the writing here. Because we read about Uzziah, and it said that he did what was pleasing in the Lord's sight, but the pagan shrines were still there. The people burned incense at those high places. So it wasn't all good. And when you get down here to Zechariah, Jehu eliminated the worship of Baal. And so we don't see that coming back up. So all of his descendants that served in his stead after his death, all of them are described as evil because they didn't abandon the sin of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. Now, technically, I would say that was less of a problem, because while worshiping those gold calves at Bethel and Dan was idolatry and was not how God chose to be worshipped, it wasn't false worship. Whereas here we're looking in Uzziah's case, the people worshiping at pagan shrines. So the people of the southern kingdom were worshiping false gods along with the Creator. So I would say in the end, spiritually speaking, we're saying that the kings of Judah, like Uzziah here, and the kings of Israel, like Zechariah here, pan out about the same. Kind of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. So why are the authors calling Uzziah good and doing what's pleasing in God's sight, and then calling Zechariah evil in the Lord's sight, just over the golden calves at Bethel and Dan? Reading on, verse 10, then Shallum, son of Jabesh, conspired against Zechariah, assassinated him in public, and became the next king. Now, there's a footnote there, so in public might mean something a little bit different. At Iblim might be the real meaning there, instead of in public. So that's an interpretation that the translators have made, to translate rather than to transliterate there and say we should render this in public. So Shallum assassinated Zechariah, became the next king. That's not what happened in Judah when their king was assassinated, but in Israel, that's how it happened. It's already happened several times. Now it's happened again. And then it goes through the standard coda that they put in. The rest of the events in Zechariah's reign are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Israel. So the Lord's message to Jehu came true. Your descendants will be kings of Israel down to the 4th generation. 4th generation didn't last very long, did it? 6 months. Shallum, son of Jabesh, began to rule over Israel in the 39th year of King Uzziah's reign in Judah. Shallum reigned in Samaria only 1 month. Then Menahem, son of Gadi, went to Samaria from Tirzah and assassinated him, and he became the next king. So now you've got 2 assassinations in just over a month, or about a month, and in both cases the assassin becomes the next king. The rest of the events in Shallum's reign, including his conspiracy, are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Israel. At that time, Menahem destroyed the town of Tappuah and all the surrounding countryside as far as Tirzah. Now recall that he came from Tirzah when he went to Samaria to assassinate Shalom. So he said, and then it says he did that because its citizens refused to surrender the town. He killed the entire population and ripped open the pregnant women. He's being cruel and inflicting agony and misery and pain and destruction. He's reflecting the character of the destroyer, not of the creator. Menahem, son of Gadi, began to rule over Israel in the 39th year of King Uzziah's reign in Judah. Well, yeah, it'd be the same year. It was only a month later. He reigned in Samaria 10 years. But Menahem did what was evil in the Lord's sight. Well, I think you've just told us that. But then it's going to say what these authors thought was the evil. During his entire reign, he refused to turn from the sins that Jeroboam, son of Nebat, had led Israel to commit. Recall that Jeroboam was the first king of the northern tribes after they broke away at the beginning of the reign of Solomon's son Rehoboam. Then King Tiglath-Pileser, now that Tapua up there had a footnote, and I forgot to check it. Let's see, Tapua, as in some Greek manuscripts, the Hebrew reads Tifsha. Okay. Not sure that's going to make a big difference because right now I'm not going to look at the map and see where those places are. So now we've got another footnote regarding Tiglath-Pileser. Tiglath-Pileser is also Pul, the Hebrew, which is another name for Tiglath-Pileser. So they decided to use the more familiar historical name for this king of Assyria. King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria invaded the land, but Menahem paid him 37 tons of silver. Footnote is to give us the conversions there, of silver to gain his support in tightening his grip on royal power. Menahem extorted the money from the rich of Israel, demanding that each of them pay 50 pieces of silver to the king of Assyria. Well, if you're needing to fund a government and you need a tax to do that, it makes sense to tax the people who have the money to pay it, because otherwise you won't get it if the people don't have it. So it says he extorted it. That again may reveal a certain amount of bias. I mean, stop to think about it. They're giving him these 50 pieces of silver each person in order to avoid an attack from the king of Assyria. Assyria being the up-and-coming world power at the time, an empire that would, before long, take the nation over and deport everybody. So what this money that they're paying to Menahem is actually going to Tiglath-Pileser, and is buying them a few additional years of freedom. So it might not be appropriate to use that term extorted the money from the rich of Israel, because they were using it to buy their freedom. They did it through Menahem, and they probably didn't get to choose. I mean, Menahem was the king. He said, do it. You do it, or he sends his men out to lift your head from your shoulders, to put it gently. But it then says, so the king of Assyria turned from attacking Israel and did not stay in the land. The rest of the events in Menahem's reign and everything he did are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Israel. When Menahem died, his son Pekahiah became the next king. Pekahiah, son of Menahem, began to rule over Israel in the 50th year of King Uzziah's reign in Judah. Now that we can make sense. It says that Menahem ruled for 10 years. He started in the 39th year, 39, 40, you add 10, you get 50. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. You know, a month here or there, and it works out. So He reigned in Samaria 2 years. But Pekahiah did what was evil in the Lord's sight. He refused to turn from the sins that Jeroboam, son of Nebat, had led Israel to commit. Then Pekah, son of Remaliah, the commander of Pekahiah's army, conspired against him. With 50 men from Gilead, Pekah assassinated the king, along with Argob and Ariah, in the citadel of the palace at Samaria, and Pekah reigned in his place. So here, over a period of 11 years or so, we've had 3 assassinations in the northern kingdom of Israel. Things aren't going very well there. And these authors seem to focus on the worship issues and not looking at the probably more pertinent official corruption that was destroying this northern kingdom, and not bringing that into the account because they're focused on religion. That's how they think. This is put together by the prophets, no doubt. So now Pekah reigned in his place. The rest of the events of Pekahiah's reign and everything he did are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Israel. Now, Pekah, son of Remaliah, will appear later in the book of Isaiah. In fact, in one of the more famous passages out of the book of Isaiah, Pekah, son of Remaliah, gets mentioned. This is the historical background against which this takes place. Scrolling down, Pekah, son of Remaliah, began to rule over Israel in the 52nd year of King Uzziah's reign in Judah. That would be the last year of it. He reigned in Samaria 20 years. But Pekah did what was evil in the Lord's sight. He refused to turn from the sins that Jeroboam, son of Nebat, had led Israel to commit. None of this addresses the condition of the people. My guess is that the people in the northern kingdom have been about what they have always been ever since the kingdom split apart. And that is that there were some that worshiped Baal, and there were some that worshiped the Creator. Recall that in Elijah's day, God says, I've reserved 7,000 to me who have not worshiped Baal. So there were some who were faithful. Probably the vast majority went along with whatever was the trend at the time. So, that doesn't make them good or evil. That just makes them, sheep. Follow the crowd kind of people. Now then it goes on to inform us that during Pekah's reign, King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria attacked Israel again. And he captured the towns of Ijon, Abel-Beth-Maachah, Genoa, Kadesh, and Hazor. He also conquered the regions of Gilead, Galilee, and all of Naphtali. And he took the people to Assyria as captives. So already now during Pekah's reign, the Assyrian defeat of the northern kingdom of Israel has begun, and already some of the people are being carried away captive to Assyria or to wherever Assyria chooses to send them. Then Hoshea, son of Elah, conspired against Pekah and assassinated him. He began to rule over Israel in the 20th year of Jotham, son of Uzziah. So, it seems like we've had quite a chain of assassinations, and that is, to me, an indication of the broken and messed up condition of government in the northern kingdom that opened the door to what's about to happen. And the prophets, and we're going to get into a fairly lengthy section here where the prophets who wrote this account will give a largely religious spin to this, and there's probably some truth to it, but this is a place that is ripe to fall. It is dysfunctional and broken. The rest of the events in Pekah's reign and everything he did are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Israel. These are just summaries hitting the points that the prophets felt were important to include. Jotham, son of Uzziah, began to rule over Judah in the second year of King Pekah's reign in Israel. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 16 years. His mother was Jerusha, the daughter of Zadok. Now, Zadok is a name for priests in the past. I don't know if this Zadok was a priest, but we have come across instances before where the king married a woman from among the family of priests in the southern kingdom. So it is possible that this Jerusha was the daughter of a priest, a Levite, in the southern kingdom. Jotham did what was pleasing in the Lord's sight. He did everything his father Uzziah had done, but he did not destroy the pagan shrines, and the people still offered sacrifices and burned incense there. He rebuilt the upper gate of the temple of the Lord. The rest of the events in Jotham's reign and everything he did are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Judah. In those days, the Lord began to send King Rezin of Aram and King Pekah of Israel to attack Judah. When Jotham died, he was buried with his ancestors in the city of David, and his son Ahaz became the next king. So there wasn't a whole lot about Jotham's reign. Now, I'm going to mention this. I mean, we haven't gotten to Isaiah yet. We will certainly talk about this when we do get to Isaiah. But one of the familiar passages out of the book of Isaiah is the one from which we get, for unto us a child is born, unto us a king is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders, and his name shall be called all those things. The familiar chorus from the Messiah is taken from that passage. And it is largely seen as a messianic prophecy. I was going to say, no, okay, this was Ahaz. All right, well, okay, we'll talk about that then when we get there. Ahaz, we haven't read about Ahaz's rule yet. We just read here that he becomes king after his father Jotham dies. So we go on then to the next chapter, chapter 16. Ahaz, son of Jotham, began to rule over Judah in the 17th year of King Pekah's reign in Israel. Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 16 years. That's only 36 when he died, huh? He did not do what was pleasing in the sight of the Lord his God, as his ancestor David had done. Instead, he followed the example of the kings of Israel, even sacrificing his own son in the fire. Footnote A, the Hebrew reads, made his son pass through the fire, which was probably a Hebrew way of saying what he'd done without making it quite as gory. Sacrificed his son in the fire, practicing human sacrifice. In this way, he followed the detestable practices of the pagan nations the Lord had driven from the land ahead of the Israelites. He offered sacrifices and burned incense at the pagan shrines and on the hills under every green tree. Then King Rezin of Aram and King Pekah of Israel came up to attack Jerusalem. They besieged Ahaz, but could not conquer him. At that time, the king of Edom, Okay, Aram, yeah. Oh, okay. B and C says about Rezin, king of Aram, and then as in the Latin Vulgate, the Hebrew reads Aram. Well, that's interesting. I'm not sure why we're referring to the Latin Vulgate, because that was the Latin translation of the Bible made by, well, I won't go into that, but so why should we refer to it? It's just a translation from the original. Why should it have any authority in deciding? Okay, the king of Edom, or they're saying King Rezin of Aram, recovered the towns of Elath for Edom, or for Aram, it said, maybe. He drove out the people of Judah and sent the Edomites to live there, as they do to this day. Well, I guess I'd have to look up the town of Elath. In fact, why don't I do that real quick and see what this says. If Elath was closer to Edom, that might make sense. Let's see. Elath, meaning a grove. The name of a town in the land of Edom, commonly mentioned with Ezion-Geber, and situate at the head of the Arabian Gulf, which was thence called the Elonitic Gulf. It first occurs in the account of the wanderings, Deuteronomy 2:8, and in later times must have come under the rule of David, 2 Samuel 8:14. We find the place named again in connection with Solomon's navy. 1 Kings 9:26 and compare 2 Chronicles 8:17. In the Roman period, it became a frontier town of the south and the residence of a Christian bishop. It is the modern Aqaba or Lila, which are mere heaps of rubbish. So, yeah, that's probably why they put Edom there, because it was a town of Edom, and it wouldn't, given its location, it wouldn't make sense for the Arameans to be taking it, which lived to the north. However, the Arameans and the Israelites, the northern kingdom, have attacked Ahaz, king of Jerusalem. King Ahaz sent messengers to King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria with this message: I am your servant and your vassal. Footnote E, your son. Okay, yeah. Come up and rescue me from the attacking armies of Aram and Israel. Then Ahaz took the silver and gold from the temple of the Lord and the palace treasury and sent it as a payment to the Assyrian king. So the king of Assyria attacked the Aramean capital of Damascus and led its population away as captives, resettling them in Kir. He also killed King Rezin. All right. Now, here's probably a good point to look at what it says in Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 7 begins, when Ahaz, son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, was king of Judah, King Rezin of Aram and Pekah, son of Remaliah, king of Israel, marched up to fight against Jerusalem, but they could not overpower it. So that agrees with what we see here. Now the house of David was told, Aram has allied itself with Ephraim. So the hearts of Ahaz and his people were shaken, as the trees of the forest are shaken by the wind. Then the Lord said to Isaiah, Go out, you and your son Shear-Jashub, to meet Ahaz at the end of the aqueduct of the upper pool on the road to the washerman's field. Say to him, Be careful, keep calm, and don't be afraid. Don't lose heart because of these two smoldering stubs of firewood, because of the fierce anger of Rezin and Aram and of the son of Remaliah. Aram, Ephraim, and Remaliah's son had plotted your ruin, saying, Let us invade Judah. Let us tear it apart and divide it among ourselves, and make the son of Tabeel king over it. Yet this is what the sovereign Lord says, it will not take place, so on and so forth. Now, it becomes interesting as we consider through here. If we go down to verse 10, again the Lord spoke to Ahaz, ask the Lord your God for a sign, whether in the deepest depths or in the highest heights. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, I will not put the Lord to the test, using, biblical language to justify disobeying God's command, as if that's going to impress God. Huh? Then Isaiah said, hear now, you house of David, is it not enough to try the patience of men? Will you try the patience of my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel. Okay, we like to quote that one as referring to Christ, and that's appropriate because of the name Emmanuel. But reading on, he will eat curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. But before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid waste. So, in other words, before this child reaches the age of majority, which in Hebrew society was 12, that's when they became a son of the law, or a bar mitzvah. But before that happens, you won't have anything to worry about. And then again, and this is also for Ahaz, later in chapter 8, the prophet writes, here am I, and the children the Lord has given me. We are signs and symbols in Israel from the Lord Almighty who dwells on Mount Zion. When men tell you to consult mediums and spiritists who whisper and mutter, should not a people inquire of their God? Recall, this is being written at the time of Ahaz. Why consult the dead on behalf of the living? To the law and to the testimony, if they do not speak according to this word, they have no light of dawn. Distressed and hungry, they will roam through the land. When they are famished, they will become enraged, and looking upward will curse their king and their God. Then they will look toward the earth and see only distress and darkness and fearful gloom, and they will be thrust into utter darkness. And then we get into chapter 9 and the familiar poems there. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light, for unto us a child is born, and so on. All of that about this particular king of Israel. Now, we just read here in verses 7, 8, and 9 how Ahaz made an alliance with Assyria, with King Pul, or Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria, and says, I want to be your vassal. Come protect me from Aram and Israel. And the king of Assyria probably didn't need a whole lot of incentive to attack Damascus and Israel, so he did what Ahaz asked. King Ahaz then went to Damascus to meet with King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria. While he was there, he took special note of the altar. Then he sent a model of the altar to Uriah the priest, along with its design in full detail. Uriah followed the king's instructions and built an altar just like it, and it was ready before the king returned from Damascus. When the king returned, he inspected the altar and made offerings on it. He presented a burnt offering and a grain offering. He poured out a liquid offering, and he sprinkled the blood of peace offerings on the altar. Then King Ahaz removed the old bronze altar from its place in front of the Lord's temple, between the entrance and the new altar, and placed it on the north side of the new altar. He told Uriah the priest, use the new altar for the morning sacrifices of burnt offering, the evening grain offering, the king's burnt offering and grain offering, and the burnt offerings of all the people, as well as their grain offerings and liquid offerings. Sprinkle the blood from all the burnt offerings and sacrifices on the new altar. The bronze altar will be for my personal use only. Uriah the priest did just as King Ahaz commanded him. It's interesting. even though the prophets have written this account, and even though you might see this as sacrilege by removing the bronze altar prepared by Solomon and putting this pagan altar in its place, or an altar fashioned and designed like a pagan altar in here, they just report it. They don't make any comment about it. And, we have suggested in the past, the form of worship doesn't commend us to God, nor does the form of worship condemn us before God. It is the attitude that we bring to worship. It is the open-mindedness with which we accept the revelation of his character. That's what matters to him, so that we are astounded and amazed at how wonderful he is, and that worship becomes natural and is accepted in heaven, even if it has to be purified through the interpretation of the Holy Spirit, because we're broken, we're human, and like Isaiah, we need our lips to be purified. So these are just forms here. The real problem is the other evil that Ahaz was engaged in. The rest of the events in Ahaz's reign and everything he did are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Judah. When Ahaz died, he was buried with his ancestors in the city of David. Then his son Hezekiah became the next king. Next chapter, chapter 17. Hoshea, son of Elah, began to rule over Israel in the 12th year of King Ahaz's reign in Judah. Now, mind you, King Ahaz only ruled for 16 years, so he's only got 4 years left. He reigned, this is Hoshea, reigned in Samaria 9 years. That would take him 5 years into the reign of Hezekiah. He did what was evil in the Lord's sight, but not to the same extent as the kings of Israel who ruled before him. King Shalmaneser of Assyria attacked King Hoshea, so Hoshea was forced to pay heavy tribute to Assyria. But Hoshea stopped paying the annual tribute and conspired against the king of Assyria by asking King So of Egypt to help him shake free of Assyria's power. When the king of Assyria discovered this treachery, he seized Hoshea and put him in prison. There's a footnote A there for the king of Egypt, or by asking the king of Egypt at Sais. I have looked that up online. I'm going to look that up in this Bible dictionary. This thing's pretty dated, but it still has a lot of valid information in it. See if it says anything about it. So king of Egypt is once mentioned in the Bible, 2 Kings 17:4. So has been variously identified as one of the kings of the 25th dynasty. There is an inscription found which speaks of a Tartan, or commander-in-chief of Pharaoh, who was sent against Sargon. His name, S-I-B-E, is similar to the Hebrew S-E-V-E, a possible form of the word which appears as so. And I think we did a sermon presentation some time back about Hezekiah, and to some extent the stories that we haven't yet come to that get repeated 3 times in the Old Testament. And I think we ran into that there and talked a little bit about who the king of Egypt might be at that point. No, okay, I had to get back up to where we were. So he tried to get the king of Egypt to help him out, and that didn't work out very well. He found himself put in prison. Then the king of Assyria invaded the entire land, and for 3 years he besieged the city of Samaria. Finally, in the 9th year of King Hoshea reign, Samaria fell, and the people of Israel were exiled to Assyria. Now, this siege of Samaria reminds us of a previous siege of Samaria that happened in the time of Elisha. Remember how the lepers decided that they were going to go over to the camp of the invading army, and when they got there, they discovered that they'd all fled in panic, and they started feeding themselves and putting on fine robes and pocketing lots of loot. And they said, "No, wait a minute, this isn't right. You know, everybody should share in this." So they went and told the people at the gate. You remember that story? And maybe the people of Israel thought something like that might happen again as Assyria besieges their city. But nothing happened, and 3 years later the city fell. Finally, in the 9th year of King Hoshea's reign, Samaria fell, and the people of Israel were exiled to Assyria. They were settled in colonies in Hala, along the banks of the Haber River, in Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. Recall that later the Medes become important as they allied with the Persians to defeat the Babylonians, and it became the Medo-Persian Empire thereafter, but that's still off into the future. Now, here comes the editorializing. This was written by the prophets, and they felt that they had to explain this in religious terms, so here's their explanation. This disaster came upon the people of Israel because they worshipped other gods. They sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them safely out of Egypt and had rescued them from the power of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. They had followed the practices of the pagan nations the Lord had driven from the land ahead of them, as well as the practices the kings of Israel had introduced. The people of Israel had also secretly done many things that were not pleasing to the Lord their God. They built pagan shrines for themselves in all their towns, from the smallest outpost to the largest walled city. They set up sacred pillars and Asherah poles at the top of every hill and under every green tree. They offered sacrifices on all the hilltops, just like the nations the Lord had driven from the land ahead of them. So the people of Israel had done many evil things, arousing the Lord's anger. Yes, they worshipped idols, despite the Lord's specific and repeated warnings. There's a footnote there for idols, footnote B. The Hebrew term, literally round things, probably alludes to dung. Weird, right? Again and again, the Lord had sent his prophets and seers to warn both Israel and Judah. Turn from all your evil ways, obey my commands and decrees, the entire law that I commanded your ancestors to obey and that I gave you through my servants the prophets. But the Israelites would not listen. They were as stubborn as their ancestors, stiff-necked, right? Who had refused to believe in the Lord their God. They rejected his decrees and the covenant he had made with their ancestors, and they despised all his warnings. They worshipped worthless idols, so they became worthless themselves. They followed the example of the nations around them, disobeying the Lord's command not to imitate them. Now, this is the prophet's take, and certainly at some point, given the people's repeated rejection of the Creator, just natural circumstances, and we've seen the corruption of their government and the instability. And this speaks not just of official misconduct, but, even in a monarchy such as this, the people do have some power, and there are political concerns that even a king has to take into account. And if there is corruption and rot at the level of the monarch, it probably reflects a certain level of corruption and rot amongst the people. And so this naturally left them susceptible to defeat at the hands of Assyria, who's out to extend their control and their influence. And in those days, you did it by conquest. So that's what they did. These things can be understood as entirely natural. Now, if you want to blame God for it, you could say, well, God withdrew his protection. As we have said many times, God's wrath is to give us over to the natural consequences of those things that we desire. And the author actually uses a rather interesting turn of phrase here in verse 15. They worshiped worthless idols, so they became worthless themselves. And there's a principle behind that. We sometimes call it the law of worship. You become like that which you worship. And that's why the New Testament makes such a point, and even the Old Testament makes such a point, that we are to worship the Creator, the one who made the heaven and the earth. We are not to worship the destroyer. And when we put destructive characteristics on the Creator, we contaminate the God we worship, and we become like that which we worship. Therefore, we contaminate ourselves, and we degrade and demoralize ourselves because of what we choose to worship. So, when it says here, they worshiped worthless idols, so they became worthless themselves, they became like that which they worshiped. And they then ended up reaping the natural consequences of what they had sown. Whatsoever a man sows, that he will also reap. It's a very simple rule. If I go out in the garden and I plant watermelon seeds, I don't wonder later in the season what I'm going to find growing in that garden. I know what I've sown. That's what I'm going to reap. I'm going to get watermelons. I'm not going to get tomatoes because I didn't plant tomato seeds, right? You reap what you sow. It's a very simple principle. The people of the northern kingdoms have for generations sown, by worshiping false gods, corruption to themselves. Now they reap it. They rejected all the commands of the Lord their God and made 2 calves from metal. They set up an Asherah pole and worshiped Baal and all the forces of heaven. They even sacrificed their own sons and daughters in the fire. Footnote C is going to be the same thing as earlier, made them pass through the fire. They consulted fortune tellers and practiced sorcery and sold themselves to evil, arousing the Lord's anger. Because the Lord was very angry with Israel, he swept them away from his presence. Only the tribe of Judah remained in the land, but even the people of Judah refused to obey the commands of the Lord their God, for they followed the evil practices that Israel had introduced. The Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel. He punished them by handing them over to their attackers until he had banished Israel from his presence. Again, this is the author's take on things. If it happened, God did it. We've got to find a reason for it that we can assign to God. This is what he comes up with. In reality, the people have laid themselves open to this by the corruption that has followed their greedy, self-oriented approach to life. For when the Lord, footnote D, when he, compare 1 Kings 11, 31 and 32, For when he tore Israel away from the kingdom of David, they chose Jeroboam son of Nebat as their king. But Jeroboam drew Israel away from following the Lord and made them commit a great sin. Well, in his mind, they were still worshiping the Creator, Yahweh. They were just using the calves as a worship prop for that. And the people of Israel persisted in all the evil ways of Jeroboam. They did not turn from these sins until the Lord finally swept them away from his presence. Just as all his prophets had warned, so Israel was exiled from their land to Assyria, where they remain to this day. Yeah, well, anyway. I was thinking some things, but they don't need to be said, so. The king of Assyria transported groups of people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and resettled them in the towns of Samaria, replacing the people of Israel. This is a technique you can use to assert control over territory. You move people around, take them away from their natural environment, from the territory that they're accustomed to, put them in a new land. They still have land. They still have the ability to raise crops and go about life and survive, but you've made them dependent on you because you've moved them to a different place. That increases your power. And that's what the king of Assyria does here. He moves people from Israel someplace else. He takes people from someplace else and brings them into Israel, or it's going to now call it Samaria. This has now become the land of Samaria. He's resettled them in the towns of Samaria, replacing the people of Israel. They took possession of Samaria and lived in its towns. But since these foreign settlers did not worship the Lord when they first arrived, the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. Now, we would question if the Lord sent the lions, or if the Lord simply allowed these lions to come through, or if he really had any involvement at all. The people who wrote this said if it happened, God did it. So if there were lions in the land, God sent them. Why? Well, it's because they didn't know how to worship the Lord. Like as if. Because we're going to read what happens through here, and we're going to take the position that the latter condition wasn't much of an improvement over this first condition. So a message was sent to the king of Assyria: the people you have sent to live in the towns of Samaria do not know the religious customs of the God of the land. He has sent lions among them to destroy them because they have not worshipped him correctly. God of the land. We have talked about this quite a bit in the past, including in the sermon presentations when we read through this part of the story. And, God is not the God of any particular land. He's the creator of the entire universe, which includes this planet and every land in it. He's the God of it all. But these people in their polytheism think, well, each land has its own God, and the God of the land watches over it, and you've got to worship the God of the land, and if you don't do it right, he's going to zap you, because that's the kind of God that they imagined in their minds, probably because if they had that kind of power, that's what they would do. So they imagine a God in their own image. Well, if I were God, what would I? Okay, that must be what God's doing, huh?
There's a lot of when we look at somebody, we tend to make a judgment on them based upon our own failings. We don't have to do that with God. We do that with each other.
Yeah. In other words, if we see somebody do something, we assign a motive to it that reflects the motive we might have for doing something like that.
Yeah.
So if I'm a selfish person and I see somebody do something, I'm going to say he did it for a selfish motive because that's the motive I would have for doing it.
I remembered somebody very blatantly telling me, I know you didn't do that. I couldn't do it, therefore I know you didn't do it. And I had done it.
Yeah.
But, you know, he projected his own failings onto me.
Yeah.
Considered me a failure. We did that.
Reading on, verse 27. The king of Assyria then commanded, send one of the exiled priests back to Samaria. Let him live there and teach the new residents the religious customs of the God of the land. Now, again, I'm going to say this doesn't make a lot of sense. These priests had not helped the people worship God to the extent that he would protect them from their enemies. So how are they going to be able to teach these foreigners how to worship Yahweh? However, the king ordered it. One of the priests who'd been exiled from Samaria returned to Bethel and taught the new residents how to worship Yahweh. But these various groups of foreigners also continued to worship their own gods. In town after town where they lived, they placed their idols at the pagan shrines that the people of Samaria had built. Those from Babylon worshipped idols of their god Succoth-Benoth. Those from Cutha worshipped their god Nergal, and those from Hamath worshipped Ashima. The Abites worshipped their gods Nibhaz and Tartak. And the people from Sepharvaim even burned their own children as sacrifices to their gods Adramelech and Anamelech. So these people just kept doing what they'd been doing. They just added in a little bit of what this Israelite priest taught them into their worship practices. Personally, I don't think God saw any significant difference in what they were doing before compared to what they're doing now. And I find it hard to believe that what they did pleased him in any way. These new residents worshiped the Lord, but they also appointed from among themselves all sorts of people as priests to offer sacrifices at their places of worship. And though they worshiped the Lord, they continued to follow their own gods according to the religious customs of the nations from which they came. And this is still going on today. They continue to follow their former practices instead of truly worshiping Yahweh and obeying the decrees, regulations, instructions, and commands he gave the descendants of Jacob, whose name he changed to Israel. Now, I have read in places recently, and some of these are outdated, and I think some of them I found even online, where people make the mistake of assuming that these people that we're reading about here are the Samaritans of Jesus' day. No. The Samaritans of Jesus' day are the Israelites who returned to the land after the Assyrians lost power and the Babylonians and probably even the Persians allowed them to return to the land about the same time that they allowed the Jews to return to that land. And so, we studied the story of Ezra and Nehemiah, and we saw how these two men excluded them because they had married foreign women and contaminated the holy seed with foreign blood, and so they weren't able to worship God, and they excluded them and created a situation where God could not fulfill the promise he had made to reunite the northern and southern kingdoms. It never happened. God couldn't do it because people stood in the way and enforced their own ideas and not let God lead. Now we read on, it says, "For the Lord had made a covenant with the descendants of Jacob and commanded them, do not worship any other gods or bow down before them or serve them or offer sacrifices to them, but worship only the Lord who brought you out of Egypt with great strength and a powerful arm. Bow down to him alone and offer sacrifices only to him. Be careful at all times to obey the decrees, regulations, instructions, and commands that he wrote for you. You must not worship other gods." Again, you become like that which you worship. If you worship false gods, you develop negative character traits and you become corrupt and evil. "Do not forget the covenant I made with you, and do not worship other gods. You must worship only Yahweh your God. He is the one who will rescue you from all your enemies." But the people would not listen and continued to follow their former practices. So while these new residents worshiped the Lord, they also worshiped their idols, and to this day their descendants do the same. Now what this day isn't clear. It's probably sometime later in the history of Judah. So at that point, the northern kingdom was no longer. Judah lasted for another 100 years or so before Babylon took them captive, and it would have been sometime during those 100 or so years that this passage would have been written and this statement would have been made. I'm looking at the clock. We have about 20 more minutes, it says here, so I think we can do one more chapter, and this will be a little less preachy for us to read through.
Hello?
Yes?
Cut it short.
Okay, we'll cut it short. I don't like to, but if we need to.
I'm needing you.
Okay, we're at a chapter break, and so we'll go ahead and cut this off early. We'll begin with chapter 18 next week at our next Friday night Bible study. And until then, we wish you well and say goodbye, and God bless.